Russo's Books, in partnership with the One Book Project and Kern County Library, presents the Women Who Inspire author interview series, featuring Marlene Wagman-Geller, author of Women Who Launch, recorded on September 12th, 2020. Hello, everybody! Welcome to the Women Who Inspire author interview series as part of Kern County Library's One Book Project. I'm Jennifer at Russo's Books. On the screen with me, you will see the fabulous author, Marlene Wagman-Geller, who wrote this lovely book right here. It is fantastic, Women Who Launch. I highly recommend that you get it. She's going to be talking with us today. And my first question for you, Miss Marlene, is, would you be willing to describe your book to anyone who isn't to anyone watching who hasn't read it yet?
Well, the premise of the book is to just take the iconoclastic enterprises that everybody knows, but the unknown story behind it that somehow has been lost in time. And what unifies the book is all these iconic enterprises stem from women. So we know like one is Mary Had a Little Lamb. We all know the little nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb, but the backstory is it was written by Sarah Josepha Hale, and she actually wrote it as a Christian tome for children. So Mary being the mother of God and the little lamb alluding to Christ. So that was, to me, that was kind of interesting to find out it had a religious background. And also by that same woman, Sarah Josepha Hale, she also launched the American tradition of Thanksgiving. So that's what I meant when I said it's the enterprises that everybody knows, like that nursery rhyme and that American tradition. But I think most people would be hard pressed to understand who was the female founder of those two.
Excellent. Who do you want to read it in the most in a perfect world?
In a perfect world,
your target audience, like the people that you really want to read it. Maybe they won't necessarily, but like if you could make them read it, who would you make read it?
I think in a utopian world, I would ask teenage girls, because one of the unifying factors in all the chapters is the women were confronted with the naysayers because of their sex, because of, whenever you offer something new, people are always going to say, oh, if it was so great, it would have been done before, or you're just a woman, or you don't have the education or the credentials. But I think one of the things that made these women successful, and they were able to leave their indelible fingerprints on time, is that they didn't listen. There was the power of persistence. And I think if we had to teach the young people of today one lesson, it'd be the power of persistence. I mean, it's like the Thomas Edison quotation. He defined genius as 2% inspiration, 98% perspiration. So it's the hardworking of the driven who succeed. And by the way, talking about Edison, when he invented the phonograph, the very first recorded words were, Mary Had a Little Lamb. So that's another little trivia trove from the book.
Excellent. Yeah, I feel like there's unfortunately a lot of people, young people too, but like older people even, that if they're not given permission, they won't try. Or if they do try without being given permission first and they hit a setback, they see that as like a sign that they shouldn't be doing that, instead of a sign, push harder in.
Exactly. And so the book is saying, what distinguishes the people who succeed from those who don't is their determination and following their inner voice rather than outer ones.
Excellent. Yes. Women Who Launch was selected as one of the companion books to fit the theme of women and girls in tech and pushing boundaries for the One Book Project here in Kern County. What inspired you to write about the 37 women that you cover in your book?
Well, what inspired me is, they were just so inspirational, and I wanted to take their hidden stories and bring it to the forefront. And most of them have passed away, or some of them have, so at least give them the posthumous recognition that they deserve. Because these women, they all had fascinating biographies. They all left a positive contribution in the world, and that was what inspired me to write about them. I wanted their stories to be known.
Yeah, not lost to the shadows of history, because
Exactly.
if you don't pay attention to it, it gets lost.
Exactly.
Yeah. Of the women that you cover in Women Who Launch, which was the most surprising for you to learn about?
Um, I think the most surprising for me was the story behind the pussycat ears caps, because I remember on the March of Washington, you see like this mile Barbie-hued caps all through the Capitol and actually all through the cities of the world. But then again, the premise of the book is always to unearth the backstories. And then I said, well, who was responsible for these caps with the ears? And it was from a California girl. Her name was Krista Sue, and she was going to the March on Washington, and she said, well, I'm a California girl, I'm going to be cold, what can I wear to keep warm? And in the same time, she said, I want to do something more than March. And then she said, and she loved her grandmother had taught her to knit. So she said, well, I can use the skills my grandmother taught me, and I'm going to wear this pink knit hat. And somehow it just became a grassroots effort. It caught on, and the pussycat ears, were all over the world. As a matter of fact, Time magazine at that time, they just had a picture of the pussycat ears. So, I mean, that's an example to the young girls. Here's a young woman in California, and she gets an idea, and lo and behold, it's on the cover of Time magazine. So the possible can become possible if we let it.
That is a fantastic message. Absolutely. Do you have a favorite of those 37 women in your book?
Well, a good mother loves all her children. If I had to pick a favorite, well, one of when the Statue of Liberty came from France, Joseph Pulitzer, in his newspaper, he had a contest. They had the pedestal for the statue, and they were trying to find somebody to write the inscription on the base. And he had a contest, and all the great writers of the time, like Mark Twain was one of them, they all submitted entries. But it was this unknown woman in New York City. She was the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants. And she said, the woman with the torch that stands in New York Harbor should be a beacon of immigrants. And that's what her poem, I Lift My Lamp Beside the Golden Door. So she said it was a very pro-immigration, and the real name of one of the names of the Statue of Liberty is the Mother of Exiles. And I really loved hearing about how she submitted the story, and it was the winning entry, and it's such a beautiful sonnet in its own right.
It really is. I don't know how many people out there have read it. If you haven't, you should look it up, because it's a really beautiful poem. Yeah,
it's just a beautiful poem, and it immortalized her story.
Who would you add or leave out if you were writing it again today?
Well, I wouldn't leave anybody out. Good. But I write blogs. Sometimes between my books, I write blogs. So I'm always on the lookout for the premise of all my books are the backstories behind the everyday phenomena that were done by women. And I just wrote a blog on Mary Anning. And Mary Anning was the woman behind the tongue twister, She Sells Seashells by the Seashore. And when she was living in the Jane Austen era, she lived in Dorset. And on prehistoric times, the land where Dorset was underwater. And embedded on the limestone cliffs were prehistoric sea monsters. And what she did was she painstakingly unearthed these skeletal remains, and she sold them, which gave birth to this She Sells, but they said seashells. And when she died, Charles Dickens said, you invented the field of geology. And so she just had a fascinating story how she would just unearth these treasures, and people from the museums around the world would go to her and get these skeletons, but they never acknowledged her because she was a woman in a man's domain. She was uneducated, and paleontology was very much a for the wealthy, pastime for the wealthy. So she was sort of lost. But then in that chapter, if I had known about her, who launched the field of paleontology, I would have definitely had included her.
Very nice.
It's almost like it's almost like, you know, when you think of a great retort 10 hours later and you go, oh, why didn't I
Yes.
see that? Well,
Oh.
when I was looking at her, I go, oh yeah, she would have been a great addition to that, to Women Who Launch.
Well, maybe for an anniversary edition or something
Oh,
like that then. Yeah.
absolutely.
For those that are interested, where can they find your blog?
I have all my blogs on my website, which is marlenewagmangeller.com. And, you know, periodically I have many, many blogs that didn't make the way into the books, but I keep adding to them.
You have 9 other books and they all are in a kind of similar vein. Do you suggest an order to read them in?
Well, it could be chronologically, it could be just what, you know, whets your interest. They're not dependent on a former book, so you can read them out of order. Even the books themselves, they're just independent chapters, so you can sort of just pick and choose the chapters you like. It doesn't have to be read, you know, from front to back. It's almost, you can dig in, see what interests you. It doesn't depend, because they're chapters unto themselves.
Wonderful. Yeah, so you don't have to like worry about losing your spot and
Or
remembering what
losing your
happened
train
before.
of thought. You know, you can sort of, you know, just pick it up, put it down, and just peruse. And the chapters are short, because so you can just read it at a sitting.
Fantastic. Do you have a favorite from those books? Like if you could only choose one to represent you, would you be able to do that?
Um, well, I think it's almost like saying a favorite child. You know, all
Child,
of them
yeah.
have their little quirks and that endear you to your heart. But I think if I had to choose one, it'd be my very first book, which I wrote in 2008. And it was called Once Again to Zelda, the story behind literature's most intriguing dedications. And the premise of that book is I took the great classics of world literature and I looked at their dedication pages, because sometimes the dedications that the great authors wrote is just as intriguing as what you find in the pages of the chapter. And it was interesting to note, why to these people, when they were writing their book, who was so important to them at that stage in life that they dedicated the book to them. And I love that it combined my passions of literature and history and trivia. I'm also grateful to that book because it launched my writing career. And I'm also grateful because of all my books, that was the only one that was written up in the New York Times. And that was like, I have that moment, fate do your worst. I had that moment. And so that's very, very, that was one of my life's most special moments.
I see. I have a list of like my life's like coolest moments too. Yeah, that was
Right. And
totally, yeah.
that was, you know, forget getting married and having a kid. No, it was being in the New York Times, hands down. Look, come on, let's get our priorities straight.
Right. Anybody can get married and have kids.
Yeah,
Who
like, you know, but one of the New York Times, and that was the most special moment.
Nice.
And that's my epitaph.
I like it.
Forget
It was in the
the
New
other
York
stuff.
Times.
Yeah, yeah, right. That's it. That's it. My proudest moment.
I think that works.
That would work, you know.
Yeah. How did you feel about Women Who Launch being a finalist for the Pacific Book Award when it was released?
Well, you know, the wind, but any wind beneath my wings is my books, and so anytime it's recognized, it just provides so much information and such an infusion of joy. So I was both honored and humbled, and great, both.
Yeah. Fantastic. I know it's always like, somebody realized it's cool.
Yeah, so you're much more expressive than me. I'm more square. But yeah, exactly what you just said. Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
So you are an English teacher. How well does that mesh with your career as an author?
Well, I think the greatest enemy almost to writing is having a full-time job, because writing is very time consuming. And what compounds that time issue is when you sell a book to the publisher, they say you have to have X amount of word count in such and such a date. So it's pressure because you have a deadline looming. And when you have a full-time job, your time is very, very finite. So in a way, I'm sort of fortunate because teaching, you know, you do get summer vacation and winter vacation, and instead of having a 9 to 5 job, it's 7 to 3. So you still have some hours which you can write. So if you do have to work, teaching is optimum because it does afford you time. If you have a very high pressure job, you're working to 7 to 7, 7 days a week, you just don't have the time to write. You have to wait to retirement if you want to. But with teaching, it does afford you a margin, some very optimum writing time. You have to wear different hats. So when I teach high school, I wear one hat. And then when I go home and I start writing, you have another hat. And it's like you have to really separate it. But I do feel grateful that teaching does afford me the time that I could write, because if I had a more time-consuming job, I just would not be able to.
Yeah. And the other nice thing about teaching and being a writer is you have an instant gauge basically built in. You're engaged with the students and what they are interested in, and what information of the world they're bringing back to you, and that gives you a whole different perspective than somebody who doesn't interact with large swaths of young people. I think it makes
Absolutely.
a big difference.
Absolutely. And the variety is good because writing is very much a solitary pursuit. It's just you and the laptop. So if you do write all the time, it's sort of, it can be very, very alienating. But if you have a job, then you do go out, you do interact with people, and then you do write. But then again, because I do have a full-time job and I write almost full-time too, I no longer do things like go out for lunch or watch movies or watch television, because in order to get something, you have to give up something else. And there's no way I really have no free time anymore. But, of course, that's a price I'm more than willing to pay. But, it does involve sacrifices because time just becomes just so finite.
Yeah. Has having to teach in a new way because of the pandemic influenced your current writing at all?
Um, well, I think in terms of teaching high school and the pandemic, I don't think it's influenced my writing. However, it does give me more time because I work about 30 minutes from my school. So really that's 5 hours a week that I'm not driving, there and back 30 minutes a day, so that's 20 hours a month. So the time that I spent driving does give me 20 extra hours a month that I was losing in transportation. So I don't think it really influenced my writing, except to realize we live more in the theater of the absurd than I could even ever imagine. But other than that, yeah, because I really compartmentalized the two, but it did free me up to have more writing time.
One of the chapters in Women Who Launch is about a group from my personal pantheon of heroes, and I even brought one of something to go with it for show and tell. The Guerrilla Girls. I have my Guerrilla Girls pencil pouch I use for my colored pencils and
I
things.
love that.
And it
I
says,
love that.
the advantage of being a woman artist, and it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek because it's things like working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world in your having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs. And it just keeps going on with all the things that
Right.
women artists face trying to be professional artists. And yeah, I saw it and I loved it. But I mean, I've always loved the Guerrilla Girls. So I wanted to ask, why did you include them?
Well, they launched a campaign against, there was a group of women, they were living in New York City, and they were very disturbed by the fact that the great museums of the city, the only women included were the naked women on the canvases. And they said, well, where's the woman artist? And so, and they knew that they had to have some kind of a gimmick to bring attention. And as they weren't the kind that walk around in thongs, like the very serious artist women, they decided to don they decided to sort of have guerrilla warfare, and they were thinking, well, what can I do? And one of the women accidentally spelled guerrilla warfare like the ape gorilla, and just through that slip, they said, yeah, let's don gorilla masks, and we'll all have different, like some has pink lipstick or different color hairstyles, but that way we can protest the women's absence of women's in museums throughout the world, but we can have anonymity. And they needed the anonymity because most of them were artists themselves, like you said, freelancing, having for different jobs. And they said, well, if we're protesting against the museums where we're working, there'll be repercussions. So that's how they got the idea of the Guerrilla Girls. And I love the Guerrilla Girls because they attack all kinds of sexism, not just in the art galleries of the world, but way before people were complaining about the sexism and the misogyny in Hollywood. Because when they were in their heyday, I mean, even in the history of the Academy Awards, we've had one woman win for Best Director. And so they were attacking that fact way before Catherine Bigelow became the first woman who won the Academy Award for Best Director. And they're just so irrepressible. I just love the Guerrilla Girls too.
Yeah, they're awesome. So thank you for including them, because I think not necessarily as many people know about them as should know about them.
Right, and
with
they're
all
just
the work they've done.
Right, and they're just on the forefront of attacking bastions of sexism.
Exactly. Yeah. What is something that you wish someone would ask about the women who launched that no one has asked yet? Now's the chance.
About the title, because it's a play on the words. So the woman who launched, I don't know if a lot of people are familiar, but in the 1950s, it was the woman who lunched. Because in the 1950s, because women could not have careers except for nurses or teachers, and it wasn't respectable because it was if you were married and you worked, it was looked at like denigrating your husband's ability to support the family, and a woman could not even open up a bank account without her husband's permission. So what could the woman do? So they lunched. Their whole world was meeting their friends for lunch, dressing in the latest style. And it sort of became synonymous with the 1950s that these women were forced to lead these very vapid, empty lifestyles. So the book was sort of the play from the woman who lunched in the 50s, how far we've come, or even these women, even though they broke out of that paradigm, to the woman who launched. So that's how I got the title. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek reference to that 1950s phrase, the woman who lunched.
Yeah, it's like there's the women who lunch, and then there's the women who launch. Yeah.
Right, and then what a difference between the spectrum, either ends of the spectrum.
It's the ubiquitous book nerd question. What is your writing process like? How do you find inspiration?
Well, my editor and I, we agree on a topic for a new book, and then becomes the challenge, what names, fit into that title. And it's sometimes daunting because sometimes women fit the bill, like they fit into the category of the topic, but they didn't have interesting lives. And so there's no chapter. And sometimes you meet, and then I research other women had fascinating lives, but they didn't fit the bill. So it's really a process of elimination who they have to, fit the paradigm of the book, and they had to have fascinating lives, because unless they had fascinating lives, where's the chapter?
What are your future projects? Your online bio says that you're currently working on book 10. Can you tell us about it?
Sure. The 10th book, is going to be called Unabashed Woman. And it was basically women who, like the Frank Sinatra song, I Did It My Way. And it was like, they just basically gave they just didn't care what people thought. They lived their lives how they wanted to live it, not according to the dictates of society. But one thing that I had to add to that is, but in their rebelliousness, they left the world a better place than they found it. So they did positive contributions, but they were very much the rebel rouser, the hellraisers, whatever you want to call them. And at the time, people looked at them like, with disgust, mainstream society. But in the end, they were very much heroines.
Excellent. I can't wait to read it. Do you know approximately when it'll be out?
It should be out mid-June.
Fantastic. We'll look forward to it. Thank you. Okay, so my librarian friends would be really mad at me if I didn't ask you what your favorite titles were when you were younger.
So when I was like in grade 7, well, I loved everything Dorothy Parker. I loved everything Oscar Wilde because they were such great writers and they infused all their writing with such great wit. I was also on a classic spree when I was in 7th grade, so I read Wuthering Heights. I loved Wuthering Heights, The Count de Monte Cristo, Les Miserables. I went through all the classics, so I was pretty much a nerd too. But I'm from Toronto in Canada, and it was very cold there. So, and I'm not athletic, so I didn't snow ski, so or ice skate, and so you turned to reading, and reading was my, because it's so cold out there. So I was always reading. I'm so grateful to the library because my parents didn't speak English very well, and they had no education. So I went by reading the books, because when you read, you absorb vocabulary. So any good vocabulary I have, it came, and my parents, there was never, see, my parents were the opposite. My parents didn't read English. So any books in my house came from the library. And then that way, because when you read, you subconsciously absorb vocabulary. So I think had it not been for my local library, I would never become a teacher. I would never become a writer, because it was the library that gave me access to books and taught me words and the love of literature. So I'm very grateful to libraries.
Yeah, if I didn't have libraries, I wouldn't have read as much as a kid because, we didn't have the money to go out and buy all these books. So, I would go and take my big pile of books in and swap it out for another big pile of books.
That was me too.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming and joining us. I just checked and there was nobody in the YouTube check. Oh, wait, we do have one chat question. Does she recall the first book she bought for herself?
What was that? The first book? What?
The first book that you were able to buy for yourself. Like you picked it out, you bought it for you.
Well, I was in Toronto, like I said, that's where I'm from, and I was in a bookstore there, and I just stumbled upon the portable Dorothy Parker, which I still have, and I just remember I just loved her sense of humor. I loved her writing style, and I remember I bought that with my own money, and I still have the book right here behind me, and that was the portable Dorothy Parker was my first purchase of many, because I have a book buying addiction.
Me too.
Yeah, I have a book buying addiction that fostered my lifelong book addiction.
It's, some people say addiction. I say, collection.
Yeah, exactly. Addictions don't have to be a negative connotation, right?
Right. Yeah. If it makes your brain healthier and,
then
gives you ideas that you never had before, I mean, those are good things, right?
That's a good habit, not an addiction.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right.